Good day. Today we're going to look at setting questions in action research. First of all, let's look at what is a good research question. Well, similar to any type of qualitative research, a good research question pinpoints exactly what you want to find out. It gives your work a clear focus and a purpose. And therefore, all research questions should, of course, be focused on a single problem or issue. Otherwise, your research is too wide. It must be researchable using primary and or secondary sources. There's no point setting a question and um, you can't research it for some reason or other. That's not usually the case. It must be feasible to answer within a time frame and practical constraints. So you can't really do longitudinal research for an aim, which has to be done in 2 years. It must be specific enough to answer thoroughly, but also complex enough to develop the answer over the space of a paper or a thesis, especially PhD level. You don't just ask one question. You usually have a lot of sub-questions, and it has to be more complex. And of course, it must be relevant to your field of study and our society. There's no point asking questions that nobody's interested in hearing the answer. And very specifically in action research, this shouldn't happen because you're researching something that people that you're working with, it's important to them. Okay, so if we look at some of the questions suited to action research versus traditional research, of course, there's many other ways of asking questions, but this is just an example to try and give you an idea. So if we take the topic of how do we support teachers to, or supporting teachers to cope with learner behavior in a special needs school, which is quite a difficult, not a difficult topic, quite a topical topic if you get my drift. So the traditional researcher question, there are a lot of questions you could ask about this, but I'm saying, say you want to evaluate if interventions are working, you would say, what impact does intervention A, which can be any intervention, have on the behavior of learners in a special needs school? All right, now that could be answered from a positivist paradigm using experimental design, or it could be answered also from a qualitative paradigm. But I have here a parallel question because this comes out of my book, which you might want to read if you want to know more about how to do participatory action learning and action research. But any participatory action research question would be more along the lines of how can teachers in a special school learn to improve their classroom management? Now, can you see the difference there? The teachers are doing the improving. They are taking agency. They are learning how to improve their own practice rather than a researcher coming in and saying, well, this intervention, which I, as a qualified XYZ psychologist, teacher, whatever, have done, worked. Now you should do the same. I don't know if that would be so effective. And then another topic, you can read this, I'm not going to do them all, reducing learner pregnancy to high school. So again, you could ask, okay, did this intervention have what effect did it have on learner pregnancy at high school? Or you could ask other questions normally like, what are the causes of learner pregnancy in high school and make recommendations about how to reduce them. Or you can get some learners themselves as peer educators and say, how can peer educators be engaged to create prevention strategies to reduce teenage pregnancy and its impact? So there you're investigating how these learners themselves can become involved in addressing the question. And so on. The last one, for instance, a very toxic workplace in a TVET college in this example, you could have asked what factors impact on workplace climate. Okay, then we would know what factors impact. We could make recommendations, but it's unlikely it would change. Or we can ask, how can managers collaborate to improve the work climate? And they are staying in that work climate after the researcher has gone. Therefore, it's more likely to be sustainable. So those are some of the differences. Understand that. So research questions in action research tend to focus on finding out how things can be changed, because that's our aim. We are a transformational paradigm. How can attitudes, how can thinking, how can behavior, How can practical circumstances be changed? And so you really got to start off with ascertaining where are we at the beginning of the research. And that is very similar then, that kind of question, to more qualitative studies. The difference is the qualitative studies end there. So if we're asking the question, how can teachers make their classrooms more inclusive? Okay, it's action research question, teachers having agency. Cycle one would then be, what are the challenges teachers face in implementing inclusive education in the specific context? Now, that is the same as a qualitative study, and then a qualitative study for an MTQ would probably end there. We know what the challenges are. Well done. But cycle two in a participatory action research design would say, what strategies can teachers develop to make the classrooms more inclusive? And cycle three, what guidelines for inclusive education can be generated from these findings? And that could go up to a PhD level. And I just want at this point to say, although I'm saying it should be how questions rather than what questions, you can all in your sub questions should be what questions or why questions or whatever. It doesn't mean to say that every single question you're asking in the study must begin with how, but usually the main question is a how question. But it doesn't have to be, as long as you're showing that the people doing it are having agency themselves. And then another example of action research, which is not participatory, but a self-study genre of action research, a la McNiff and Whitehead and many others, we always ask questions around, how do I improve my practice in specific situations? So how do I improve my teaching, my inclusive education practice? How do I improve my teaching of special needs learners? How do I make my teaching more socially just, or so on? So in that kind of design, the I is central. So it's about me, it's I, not the researcher. And normally the sub-questions include, what is my concern and why? So that would be, instead of asking, questions up front, you would ask them as to structure your thesis. So what is my concern and why? That would be your proposal, your literature chapter. So what is my concern is perhaps my teaching is not inclusive enough. I don't feel that I'm engaging all learners. And that I would explain and draw on propositional theories and existing literature to explain that. The why part is, why am I? Why do I care about that? So there you will bring in your values and your vision and your teaching philosophy and your concern that you're not working in alignment with what you're professing you're doing. And then the second question would be, well, what can I do about it? Again, you're drawing from existing theories, so you would use that would be your theoretical framework. Why, what kind of things do you think? So, using more participatory methodologies, or whatever your topic is. And then how can I gather evidence to show the problem as it unfolds? That would be your methodology chapter. What did I do about it, and what did my doing achieve? That would be your findings chapter. How can I show that my conclusions are fair and accurate? You would want that the evidence you provide in your findings chapter would answer that. And then what conclusions can I draw from this? What's the significance of my finding? What is my contribution to theory, to practice, and so on? And that would be your final chapter. So this is, a lot of people sort of shy away from doing self-studies, but for teachers who are working every day in a classroom, to me, this is such a valuable master's or PhD approach. There are many PhDs worldwide in this genre of action research, and that it would really help to improve, if everybody did that, it would help to improve the quality of teaching and learning in our South African schools. Much needed. Okay, one more example. Well, I think it's the second last example, but this is a parlor example. So a PhD student of mine, Adam Leduli, he was a principal in a teacher training college, and he asked the question, how can a group of students with disabilities collaboratively advocate for the creation of an inclusive environment at their college? Because he was asked by the government to develop policies for inclusive education instead of just going away and developing it himself or with, of course, his colleagues. He decided to involve those affected by the problem. So it's sub-questions were, what are the lived experiences of students with disabilities, starting off with the status quo? How can they use this knowledge that they've gathered in cycle 1 now to take action to make the environment more inclusive? And then cycle 3, what guidelines can be formulated? And in his case, that was a participatory action research cycle where the students themselves came up with ideas for guidelines, and then he, through his managerial and principal hat, refined them and looked at them through theory. And then just a straight power example. I think we had this question earlier on, but it was about engaging peer educators or learners at school as peer educators in the prevention of teenage pregnancy. So the main question was, how can peer educators create prevention strategies to reduce teenage pregnancy and its impacts? Cycle 1 was starting the status quo. These peer educators gathered data from their peers, their other learners, their own experience as well. What do they know, feel, and experience regarding the causes and effects of teenage pregnancy in that particular community context? How can peer and then once they had that data, they asked how can peer educators use these findings? So they used the findings to create relevant and contextualized strategies for addressing teenage pregnancy in their school and community. And then we also looked at, or they looked at, how can it be implemented in a school system? Because it's not always easy to make do these different strategies and changes in the school system. And then what recommendations could be made? So these last two examples that I've given you are from PhDs. So for a master's, perhaps you'd only need 2 cycles. But the questions must show to recap how the people affected by the problem are using their agency to generate their own knowledge and their own theories about how things can be improved. So I hope that helps you understand research questions in action research.